right, good evening everybody, welcome. It's my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the Perpich Center for Arts and Education. This is the latest installment of our Native Authors and Artists series. My name is Dr. Michael Buck. I am on the PDR team here, and I'm the music specialist for professional development and resource programs. Briefly about the Perpich Center, we are a state-funded educational leader in arts education. Our agency consists of three parts: the Arts High School, which we are in right now, the Professional Lending Library, which we will visit in just a little bit, and then also the Professional Development and Resource Programs, which again, myself and my colleagues are involved in hosting this event today. The main task of our PDR programs is to provide curriculum support and then workshops and learning opportunities for our arts educators. My presence tonight is here to host this presentation and facilitate another important educational opportunity. And it is my pleasure to welcome our guest, Dr. Anton Treuer. Briefly about Dr. Treuer, he is professor of Ojibwe at Bemidji State University and author of many books. He holds a BA from Princeton University and an MA and PhD from the University of Minnesota. He is also a member of the governing boards for the Minnesota State's Historical Society. And I had this down when I practiced it. Wadukadadi. There we go. All right, got it. Ojibwe Language Institute, and received many prestigious awards and fellowships. Some of these include the American Philosophical Society, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the National Science Foundation, the MacArthur Foundation, the Bush Foundation, the First Nations Development Institute, and the John Simon Guggenheim Foundation. In 2018, he was named the Guardian of Culture and Lifeways and recipient of the Pathfinder Award by the Association of Tribal Archives, Libraries, and Museums. And his equity, education, and cultural work has put him on a path in service around the nation and the world. So please give a warm welcome to Dr. Anton Treuer. All right, so to start things off, Anton, tell us a little bit about your perspective and your story, having grown up as a descendant of the Leech Lake nations and kind of coming from the Bemidji area. What is it that you would like us to know about your background?
Thanks, everybody, for the warm welcome and for a great question to get us started. You know, nobody sees the world the way that it is. We all see the world the way that we are, and we're all different. So I'm happy to share a little bit about my experience. I'm a product of many different threads in a family tapestry and a community one as well. Sometimes it surprises people because I show up kind of brown and braids, well, it's a man bun today, and some beads, that my father was not Native at all. He was born in Vienna, Austria. He was an Austrian Jewish immigrant and survivor of the Nazi Holocaust. He made it out of there at age 13 and made it to America at age 14. By age 17, he lied about his age, signed up for the U.S. Army. I think he wanted to kill Nazis. But they sent him to the Pacific Theater, stationed in the Philippines. But eventually, he made his way to Minnesota, met my mom, and here I am. My mom grew up in a little village called Bena on the heart of the Leech Lake Reservation, population 400. Half of them are my cousins, and that's not an exaggeration. And I think for her, harvesting wild rice or hunting was less a cool cultural pastime and more a necessary means of survival. All the kids had to help with food production. And it's interesting, she was born on the reservation, she was raised on the reservation, lived there for the first 18 years of her life. During her whole childhood, she only met one professional Native person ever. And there are about 10,000 enrolled members at Leech Lake now. So out of 10,000 people, they couldn't find one teacher, social worker, police officer, The one professional person she met was the school nurse. She thought, maybe I can do that. So she ended up finishing high school and going to nursing school. Came back to work for our tribe's health program, and she thought, even here, Native people were getting pushed around. Enough of that, she went back to school and got a law degree. Became the first female Native attorney in the state of Minnesota. So when I was a kid, she'd bring me with her to court. She'd say, you sit there, don't say a word. So, I'd sit there, not say a word. And I couldn't remember her court cases, but I remember things. She was the only woman in court. I remember that. She and her law partner, Paul Day, they were the only natives in court. I remember that. And I would come walking out of there thinking, you know what? We can do stuff. That was like the D in the DEI. Makes a big difference. So, from both of my parents, in very different ways, they had pretty dynamic stories, I think. They both loved to tell stories. They both were trying to change the world that they lived in, not just for themselves, but for others. And, we just, for example, had the retirement celebration for Paul Day, who was my mom's old law partner. And I had to say, you were the first Native man doing anything professional that I ever saw. We were in a room full of Native lawyers, judges, social workers, and educators. I said, look how far we've come and how much further we have to go. So that much kind of equipped me, I think, for some of the stuff that I do. Although, I don't know if you want the long or the short version of this, but I finished high school thinking, I'm going to get out of town and never come back, which is a plan that a lot of high schoolers have. And I got into Princeton University, and I thought, hooray, all the ignorance will be behind me. And it was so naive on my part. I got there, the first person I met said, are you Native? Dude, where's your tomahawk? And I remember thinking, oh no, the brambled racial borderland will follow me everywhere I go. And these are the dumbest smart people I've ever met. But I ended up having a great experience there. My freshman year assigned roommate was a citizen of Sri Lanka, and we became best friends and roomed together 4 years in a row, best man at each other's weddings and all that. But by the time I finished, I just wanted to come home and never leave. And I probably freaked my parents out again when I said, well, I'm not taking a job, and I'm not going to graduate school. I'm just going to come home and walk the earth and hang out with my elders. And they said, well, that sounds beautiful. Good luck paying for that, because we're done. And I did. And I ended up living with this guy named Archie Mose, and he could hardly speak English. And I ended up just kind of stumbling into a life-altering journey with him. It was kind of like Forrest Gump when he realized he could run. After that, every time he went somewhere, he was running, and he never thought it would take him anywhere, but it did. And so I ended up kind of becoming a language and culture guy. Eventually, I did go to graduate school. Eventually, I did take a job. But today, I probably sit on a three-legged stool. So one of which is language, culture, and community service. I officiate at life ceremonies, even traditional funerals, things like that. It's about a third of my time. That's all uncompensated. About a third of my time is I work at a university and write books, and we'll be talking about that tonight. Teaching Ojibwe language, history, culture, formerly trained as a historian. And about a third of my time, too, is I do lots of diversity, equity, and inclusion work. To me, they're like three strands of a braid. They all reinforce and connect with one another.
So you mentioned that you went off to school, did your undergrad at Princeton, kind of felt like you were going to come home, and then did some other things. But then, what pulled you back to kind of settle? I mean, you made a life for yourself in Bemidji. Are there any particular threats that kind of pulled you back to settle into that area and take a job at Bemidji State and so forth?
Oh, I love where I live. I really do. For so many different reasons. My relatives have been buried on my mom's side in the same place longer than America has been a country. And I think most Americans, we emphasize our freedoms, like go to school, spread your wings, fly. And if you get a job offer and the job offer's in California, move to California and become Californian. And we celebrate that freedom, even a malleable identity. And there's a beauty to it, but there are consequences too. Most people have a couple of kids, they move to two totally different states, and they're trying to use Facebook and FaceTime and keep it real. But it's very different than my relatives have been buried in the same place longer than America's been a country. And my cousins are kind of like siblings because we've always grown up together, migrating from one house to the next amongst all of our aunts and uncles. And so for me, there are many things I love about it. You know, as an indigenous person, even though all humans, if you go far enough back in time, were indigenous to somewhere, it's still a connection to place. Even though a lot of indigenous people have been displaced from their place. And, you know, I think that is something that's still a really vibrant and important thread. I've been able to raise all of my kids with all of their grandparents within 10 minutes of the front door. And you can't put a price on that. Our ceremonial life is there. And so I routinely have turned down jobs that would pay me lots more money because it's not only about the money. And I feel pretty good about the decisions. You know, you have to ask my kids what they think about it. But ultimately, I think there's a great value to our ability to connect with one another, to place, to tradition, you know, cultural practice. And those things would have been much more difficult to engineer if I moved somewhere else. And we found plenty of all the other kinds of life success that people look for in our space too. Doesn't mean there aren't challenges, you know, but that's certainly some of what has been motivating that. And I think now, you know, I rely upon our ceremonies, community, and so forth. We kind of become who we hang out with, and we become what we do. So culture is not something simply that we profess or believe, it's something we do. And it would just be so much harder to do it somewhere else. I knew what it was like living, you know, in New Jersey when I went to college, or in Milwaukee, which I did for a couple of years getting my career started. And I just spent most of my time trying to get back home, you know? So for me, that certainly works. And I think now too, I'm just at the service of other people. So I'd be letting a lot of people down if I just made it all about me.
So one of the things that we're here today to talk a little bit about is the contributions of Native American, American Indians, especially Minnesota American Indians, to our society. And one of the things we'd like to hear is your voice, realizing, of course, that it is your, you know, your experience and your opinion, not necessarily representative of all Indians, as you mentioned in your book. And by the way, do a shameless plug, his book is available actually at the end. You're going to get a copy of it. But this is another one that we have in our library here. Everything that I wanted to know about Indians but was afraid to ask. So this, I think you'll find, you know, there's a lot of great things in there. I've really enjoyed getting a chance to know about that. But thinking about, you know, what is it that you would like us to know when we talk about your people, the customs, the traditions? What is the respectful kind of language? Like, what should we know about referring to your people and your experiences and so forth?
You want me to address terminology first? Or?
Yeah, terminology would be great to start, yeah.
Yeah, well, as is the case, and maybe I should just back up and say, you know, as you mentioned, in spite of the cute title for the book, there's no way that anybody knows everything there is to know about anything. I live in a house full of Native people. I don't even know what they're thinking half the time. I really only represent myself, and I am all the things about me. So I am my age, my gender, you know, my sexual orientation, my experiences, and other people, even in my house, have different things of those. So it's important to put that disclaimer out there. I think sometimes there's a tendency, especially if somebody's from a minoritized group, to be like, oh, you know, what do people in your group think about this? When somebody wouldn't necessarily ask, what do white people think about abortion, good or bad, and expect a simple, easy answer. So I think there's a growing awareness that, like, not everybody thinks the same. We're internally diverse, but I think as Native people, we get imagined a lot and understood very little, so it's a good disclaimer to put out there. Having said that, this topic of terminology is one of those unsettled debates, and as has happened, you know, with the Black community, you know, the Hispanic, Latino, Latina, Latinx, Latinx community, like, there isn't always universal agreement on all the labels. So personally, I would love for us to be able to do what they did in Canada, where they had a national conversation, representatives from all the communities, and at the time, they had been using Indian or Aboriginal, and they decided to settle on First Nation, which is not too many syllables, everyone can pronounce it, it speaks to sovereignty, everyone knows what you're talking about. So instead of calling the places reserves, they switched to First Nations, and for the humans, First Nations people. They technically actually have 3 labels in Canada. First Nations, the Arctic Indigenous folks said, we want to stick with Inuit. And then there's another group called Métis, which actually is kind of a hybrid culture, even their own language, Michif, which largely has Ojibwe and Cree verbs and French nouns, and has a distinct political identity. So they have 3 in Canada. But, so even there, it wasn't quite simple. Here, you know, whatever, we could call ourselves Native Nations or something like that to distinguish us from our Canadian brothers and sisters if necessary. Unfortunately, though, not everybody's behind that. And, you know, so be it. I think ultimately you will find some who really have held on to Indian or American Indian, mainly because that terminology is in statutes as a legal status. So, you know, Indigenous people of, you know, what is now the United States of America are not just a racial or ethnic group, but have a distinct political identity and a nationhood, a sovereignty that predates the United States of America and predates Minnesota. And so it's a way to speak to that, because if you just use Indigenous, you don't know if we're talking about a Maori from New Zealand who happens to be on vacation, or someone who has this unique political status here. So some have favored that, so you'll hear American Indian Movement, National Congress of American Indians. That seems so old school. Wasn't Christopher Columbus lost? Yes, he was lost, you know, but the label is kind of stuck around. However, it is old school, and, you know, yes, not only was Christopher Columbus lost, and it's a misnomer, it's confusing in other circles, like American Indian is different from Indian American, you know, so it'd be nice to have something that everyone can really understand from all of those different experiences. You still have to establish some context, even with that one. I do think, as a general rule, Native American, and Indigenous are considered politically correct, less likely to be offensive or something like that. But you still have to establish the context, you know? And so here we go with a few sentences to say who we're talking about before we start the conversation. So, you know, you'll find me, like in the book and in other things too, I tend to use them all somewhat interchangeably, aware of their shortcomings, mainly as a means of just establishing safe space. But I think certainly once we establish a context, we're good. The other thing I'd recommend is that if you're working for a school, group, agency, or what have you, just have a conversation with your Native stakeholders. And you can say, what do you want us to do? And whatever they come up with, you can do that, and it does a couple things. It establishes communication with your Native stakeholders, puts them in an empowered position. You know, if anyone else gives you grief, you can say, thank you for your feedback, we take terminology seriously. This is coming from our Native Parent Committee, and it gets you a get out of getting beat up around the ears card. We could all use one of those, and a way just to sustain the conversation.
Many people here are educators, and one of the things that has been on our mind has been the Minnesota legislation around the standards, and especially in the arts area, there's very specific language about the contributions of the Minnesota American Indians, is the terminology that they use. And, you know, we're really, I think many of us are kind of excited about the opportunity to be able to, you know, share and participate in that, but it also brings, you know, at times it can be overwhelming for people that are outside the culture. So, you know, where do you recommend it for educators that are trying to, you know, explore this topic? Where do you recommend they start?
Yeah, great question. So there are a few things to talk about. One of which is that I realize that most Americans got a sugar-coated version of Chris Columbus in the first Thanksgiving and feel kind of flat-footed, speaking more deeply to the experience of a whole group of people that they don't know an awful lot about. And that feels uncomfortable. So I get that. And at the same time, if you think about it, like this often happens. There's a teacher, Columbus pops up in the curriculum, and they're thinking, if I say this, Italian Americans are going to get really mad at me. If I say that, have you ever seen an angry native mom? What am I going to do? As little as possible. And then what happens is we build our educational response less around the needs of the kids and more around our own racial comfort or lack of it. So the first thing I'd say is be brave, lean in. If all you know is enough to know you don't know, then it's time to read some books, it's time to pay attention, it's time to pick up tools and resources. We have to up our game. Of course, we have to love all the kids. But, when we talk about what's happening in our educational space, we have so much work to do. So much work to do to properly serve all of the kids coming through the door. The majority of the students in America are students of color. And it doesn't matter Democrats or Republicans or building walls or not, that's who's here. So we have to speak to an empowered experience for those students. And kind of one of the things that has happened, and I won't digress too much on this, but when people talk about white privilege, they're not talking about financial advantage. They're talking about the privilege of going to school and having your race widely represented in who is teaching and what is taught. And even the most economically disadvantaged white student will likely have a teacher from their own racial group, will likely see white people in the curriculum somewhere, and in a positive and an empowered way, like the President of the United States or something. And I have never had a teacher from my own racial group. K-12, college, master's, up to my PhD. And that is the most common experience for Indigenous learners. And it has effects. Because I remember going to school thinking, you know what? How come I never get to learn about me? And from kind, good-hearted people, taking a humble wage to do one of the most important jobs on planet Earth. It was the absent narratives that were screaming, you and yours aren't important, aren't relevant, and don't matter. Because if we were important, relevant, or mattered, somebody would have said something in 13 years of an education. So we do need this stuff in the standards. It is scary for people who don't have experience around it, and there are a lot of people trying to make it a little bit easier and more productive. So I'll speak to the art standard stuff in just a sec, but there's been a big overhaul in Minnesota's education standards broadly around Native topics. So, there's a lot in the social studies area, but also in science. They're asking the science teachers to speak to Indigenous ways of knowing and bodies of knowledge, and they are trained in the scientific method, right? So that one is scary. There's stuff in the arts curriculum. There's, in many different areas, and the language is shifting from looking at natives as another racial or ethnic group to looking at native nations as a distinct political identities and how do they work and function, what is a tribal government, and things like that. So all of that is big change. To help make it a little bit easier, there are all kinds of efforts and initiatives underway, and some of them are really exciting and really helpful for educators. So I know there were a couple folks in the room who were part of the Understand Native Minnesota effort. So Shakopee had invested $5 million to try to help make this easier for educators. They combed through the standards, they built out a 40-page educator guide, went through all the ELA standards, and they scoped it out, by grade level, benchmark learning outcome, and standard, and then offered recommended resources. So the problem used to be, how do I find a needle in a haystack? Now the problem is, which needle in the stack of needles do I pay attention to? And that one, it's not comprehensive, but it offers a starting place. Pay attention to this needle first, and then go from there. And so I think that's helpful for people who feel a little flat-footed. But there are many other things going on. We've been developing content with Why Treaties Matter. It's an emerging effort. There are like 16 educator guides there. There's content published even through the Minnesota Conservation Volunteer, again, tagged to standards, mainly at the middle school level. And we did pieces on George Bonga, who was really interesting. He said, I am the first white man and the first black man west of the Mississippi. And he married a Native woman. And so it's an interesting multiracial story from the 1800s, a very Minnesota thing, but also, fascinating. And there's like teacher guides and, again, all tagged to standards. Minnesota Partnership for Collaborative Curriculum has a lot of new content out there. So there are many things going on, maybe even a little beyond the scope of everything we're trying to do here tonight. I can point people to, to my website or the Understand Native Minnesota website, and everything's linked up there, and it's easy to follow those things. I have a list of Indigenous authored books, and they're kind of separated by, topic area and reading level and different things like that. So I think that should also be pretty helpful. It's all free.
Great. Yes, and those are wonderful resources to have. And we also will have, as a takeaway today, if you didn't pick it up, some list of Anton's books and so forth. So, and where you can find more information about that. I'm thinking specifically about the arts standards, the basic framework for the arts. The model we use is the create, perform, or present, depending on which art form you're in, respond, connect. And in what ways do you see that we can access, those contributions of Native Americans in have you seen specific examples of things that you could point to that say, hey, that is something that I think is really important to know about or do?
Oh, sure. There are many ways to approach that. So with regard to, create or connect, like even, in the Ojibwe creation story, we talk about how the Great Spirit made all things and, made this earth and put water and grasses and trees and growing things and made animals, four-legged, birds, fish, last of all humans. And that there's kind of this teaching that we're the last things put here. And among the teachings that come from that is if humans were to perish from the earth, everything made before us would get by just fine, honestly, probably better than ever. But if anything created before us were to perish, surely we would too. So there's this kind of humble reminder of our place in creation. We are not given dominion over the earth. We are part of the web of life, not its masters. We are dependent on these things. So in Ojibwe art forms, you'll see a lot of floral patterns in beadwork and other things, and it's kind of this humble reminder of our place in creation, as well as a reflection of what we see in the natural world. So it's easy enough to do a create project, could be around beadwork or any number of other things, where you can show this, and people could be, painting or creating or making, and thinking about this connection to this teaching. And it's kind of like, I don't know, when you hear something, it's in one ear, out the other, When you have to repeat it back, you might remember it a little bit longer. When you do it, you'll remember it longer yet. So when you're putting your hands into creating something, thinking about that, it starts to percolate and gives you a lot to reflect upon teachings like that. And there are many, many other things too that I think make good food for study. My son's a guitar maestro going to Perpich here, and we watched the documentary Rumble, Indians Who Rock the World. And it's pretty stunning how deeply Native people have shaped the music that everybody loves. I think not as well known or as thoroughly appreciated, but it is there. It's easy to find. That's a free, streaming view on Netflix or what have you. But there's so many different ways to approach Native contributions to the world that we all, navigate. And I think honestly, though there's some related issues to discuss around, what's culturally appropriate and what's cultural appropriation kind of things. But honestly, when you look at music and art, these are arenas where all cultures are sharing and exchanging information. It would be very difficult to find an art form or musical tradition that is not informed by many cultures. And so it offers ways to show empowered contributions from all of us. And I think that's an easy entry point to hold that up. There are many other specific examples, whether you're looking at visual arts or you're looking at music or whatever you happen to be doing. But certainly, that's part of the work.
Are there any cultural stereotypes that kind of jump out to you, as kind of problematic, or things that you see often that you would like to, share with us, of things that are bothersome or noticeable?
Oh, I suppose we could do a whole list on that. Honestly, here's what I'd say. There's a great TED Talk by a Nigerian literary figure named Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. If you can't remember her name, the title's pretty easy. It's called The Danger of a Single Story. And in The Danger of a Single Story, which by the way has millions of views on YouTube, it's very easy to find, among the things she shares is that the problem with stereotypes is not so much that they're incorrect, as much as they're just incomplete. And they leave you with a narrow, single story to understand the experience of a whole group of people. And if you do that, you're likely going to get it wrong. So I'll sometimes, a little tongue-in-cheek, use the example like, if we wanted to study white people in America, and a lot of people do actually study white people in America, but we only looked at poverty in rural white Appalachia and started thinking, oh, those poor people. What happened to the white family? Maybe we should put some donations together for them. The meth? Oh, it's not going to tell you everything you need to know. It won't even tell you everything you need to know about being white in Appalachia, right? It's a single story narrative. Same thing if you only looked at white people on New York's Upper East Side and thought, wow, everything handed on a silver platter, it's amazing. Wouldn't tell you everything you need to know. But if you did study white people in America, you don't get a single story, right? You get many stories. You can even watch the movies. Here's some white guys who are good guys. Here's some white guys who are bad guys. Here's some white guys who are good guys Breaking Bad. There's a whole series about that. Here's some white guys who are bad guys turning good. Check out Jamie Lannister in Game of Thrones. And so you can even watch a movie like Psycho and you're not like, white people, run. If you were to study Native Americans, though, you will see more movies about aliens than Native people. And even the movies, usually do good Indians, bad Indians stuff. Even a sympathetic movie like Dances with Wolves is like the Lakota are the good Indians and the Pawnee are the bad Indians, and the white guy's better at being native than the natives, and just like Tom Cruise is better at being samurai than anyone in Japan, right? And it is evolving, and we do have reservation dogs, and it's improving, but evolving, not thoroughly evolved. And so this is why we need a diversity of voices and an internal diversity of voices speaking to these experiences. As Native people, also the educational standards also are evolving. But 87% of the education standards that mention Indigenous anything are stories from before 1900. And they're stories in social studies, and maybe a little bit in literature. And so that alone can just reinforce the idea that we are something that happened in the past. And it's amazing, especially when I travel in the American South or the East, people will say things like, it's a shame they killed all the Indians. And I'm like, wait a minute, I'm feeling pretty good today. And they're like, oh yeah, that's a good point. Literally not even in the consciousness, that we exist. And so it should be impossible to graduate from high school in the United States of America and not know anything about the people who've been here for tens of thousands of years and are still here, as thousands of years of human history still in the making. So that is a failure of our systems and expectations. And within that, I mean, I'm happy to fire away at any number of them, but I would say we are complex people. Our economic realities are complex. Our cultural realities are complex. We're not any one thing. Even in a state like Minnesota, I think there still might be some, you'll hear people say two radically, diametrically opposed stereotypes. One, Indians, they're all rich from casinos. And another one, they're all living in squalor on a reservation. As if both could be true, And some people don't even think about it. And the reality is just evidence like that alone of how complex it is. So yes, in 16 counties in the state of Minnesota, tribes aren't big employers, but the biggest employers of all, be nice to natives. You probably end up working for one someday. And at the same time, yes, there's disproportionate representation, 23% of the native population is below the poverty line. And that's gross, and that's an indictment on America, not native people. So, within just those two little sound bites, there's a lot more to understand. And so it just behooves us to understand. And I think also when you just get to know people and spend time, with them, it automatically starts to disrupt those things.
All right, so I have one more question, and then we'll maybe open it up if anybody in the audience would like to ask a question or two before we move down to visit the library and the resources. What brings you joy when you share the either resources or the stories or the history of your people? What kinds of things bring you joy?
I have so much to be grateful for, and I have so much joy in so many of the things that I do. I feel truly blessed in many, many ways. I get a lot of joy both in my affinity space and with my family, but also in mixed company doing different kinds of work. I feel like I need to balance that out. Like, I need time, not just with my family, but I also need time at our ceremonies and at the service of Indigenous people, rather than just burning myself out in the service of everybody else. So I need some of that. I also feel like I don't want to only do that. I want to reach out and see the beauty in all humans and pull us together and try to make change together. And I think ultimately, when we do that, we see some of our best and most productive work addressing justice and other things. I feel genuine joy doing both of those things. And, I think, like all humans, I got some things, that I need for me individually, for my family, for my community, for the world, and I find fulfillment in all of those things. And it kind of depends on what's going on, what I'm craving the most, but there's a lot out there. It's amazing, in spite of 500 pretty rough years, we're still here. We still have living languages, beautiful cultures. There's so much depth. It's a real testament to the fortitude of our ancestors and those who are alive today, because there is a monumental effort underway to keep our languages and cultures and native nations alive and thriving. And it's bearing genuine fruit, which is truly inspiring.
All right, do we have anybody from the audience that would like to ask any questions before we step out here? Yes, please. There's a microphone right here, so we can make sure we can hear it.
I can speak loud enough. Well, I'll use the mic. In regards to as an English teacher, the English language standards, ELA standards, or just, overall the influx of the Native American standards in the curriculum, as a Native person, how would you like to see the teaching of those standards come to fruition? And how would you like to see that done with students as we move forward with these standards? What do you envision, and what would you like to see as a Native person?
You talking about what to teach or how to teach it?
More like how. How would you like to see that done with students? Because, we could debate what, for everybody,
Yeah.
but the how, yeah.
Yeah, so first of all, And, I think obviously there are like culture wars going on. But I think as educators, our jobs are not to tell people what to think. Our job is to teach people how to think. And when we can help them develop critical thinking skills, they can navigate all that stuff and figure it out on their own. So I favor activities that help people figure out how to think, how to analyze, how to evaluate, and they will come to their own opinions on all of the things. We should ask good, guiding questions and coach the quest for learning, rather than just memorize things and spit them out. Encouraging the creativity of our young people, which is inspiring, unbelievably inspiring. They have a lot to say. They have a lot of perspective. And I think we have a lot to learn from them. So, there's a little mantra from the business world that kind of actually helps in education, which is that, leaders, we have to have this adaptive leadership approach, where we lead while listening. And leaders who don't listen are soon surrounded by people who have nothing to say. So, as an educator, we got to lead while listening. And I've been humbled so many times. My kids have taught me so many things, so many ways. I got a lot of stories about it, because it's sometimes they're actually quite hilarious, but also very helpful. So, as a broad philosophical approach, I would say those things. Exactly how to go about, engaging with how to think. There are many different ways to do it. And I think we've had very limited modalities that we're told as teachers to use. We expect ourselves to be content experts. Well, that's half of the stress right there. Who's going to be a content expert on all the people and all the things and all the cultures? I was just over at Elk River, they got 70 different languages spoken by kids in the district. Who's going to master 70 languages? Not realistic, So instead of cultural competency on all the things and being a content expert on all of them, it's just cultural humility. I'm going to teach a little bit about what I know. I'm going to invite you to share what you know. We're going to ask some questions about stuff that none of us know, and we're going to figure it out together. I'm going to learn right along with you. I got to tell it to my kids all the time too. It's like, well, we're in uncharted territory. I've never done this before. Here's what it looks like to me. What do you think? Let's figure it out. And I think that's just way more honest and way more productive. And kids can smell bullcrap, right? And they can smell sincerity. Yeah, and I think that's just way more effective as we go. With regard to the voices, right? How to get native content that's meaningful in there. As a general rule of thumb, I think if activities or content or things that are being shared, if it's native-led, it's pretty strong. If it's native-inspired, it's a little thinner ice. So as a teacher, even if you're not native, you can pull in, a YouTube video where a native person's talking about a topic, and then you can discuss. You can pull in literature generated by native people, and you've got authentic voices, and you can analyze and discuss. And so there are many ways to get those voices into your educational space. They may not agree with one another. There are all kinds of great things to have a debate about. I was just over at a Cretan-Durham Hall, a private Catholic school, and so they're reading tough books. They're having debates about, would reparations bring us closer to justice? High schoolers. No one is graded on the perspective that they bring, but their willingness to engage and bring a perspective and to understand the content and prove they've actually read the literature, develop a view on it, things like that. You don't have to chase people to a certain way of thinking. Yeah, but you can still wrangle with tough topics in mixed company, no matter how, and I would say that is a politically more conservative place, but they're still dealing with some very tough topics in, I think, a very productive way. There are lots of ways to do it.
I'll put in just a quick shameless plug here. The Perpich Center is going to host an event on August 13th. It is a conference called Rootedness and Futurity. And our goal in this conference is to bring Native perspective and voices. It's led by a couple distinguished Native presenters as well as the Perpich staff. And we're hoping to be able to spend an entire day digging in, learning more about the cultural framing and how that might apply in our classrooms, and then actually spending some time trying to figure out, well, what would that look like in our classroom? So I would encourage you to watch. The registration for that will become available. It'll be coming out in Dr. Barden's next newsletter, also in the music next newsletter as well. And I know this would be a great segue for you to talk about what you have coming up in the future. I know you're about to release some books and materials. Would you like to share a little bit about what you're working on?
Oh, sure. I'm so excited about this one. I'm actually over 20 books that I've published so far, and mainly I have worked with nonfiction and also with Ojibwe language work. So I've done, recording of stories of elders and transcription, translation work, things like that. But I wrote my first novel. Work of fiction, and it's a young adult novel called Where Wolves Don't Die. And it's the story of a 15-year-old Native kid who, I guess he's kind of looking for clues to a murder, but kind of finds himself in the process. So it's, gets into trouble and gets sent to the family's equivalent of juvie to go run a trap line with his grandfather in the Canadian wilderness. And so it's both a thriller, but also kind of a tender coming-of-age story. And I really had a great experience writing it. I read it out loud in kind of chapters to my kids, ages 12, 14, 17 now, but I guess 16 at the time I was reading, and got their feedback and stuff. And so I was just really excited by their response to it as we were going. And I think, I think honestly, even in Native Lit, that too is an evolving space. So it has taken a long time just to have Native voices telling stories and to have them in empowered positions. And of course, Minnesota's Louise Erdrich won a Pulitzer Prize, and it's taking off. And Angeline Bolley is on a New York Times bestseller list for 30 months in a row, doing great. And so all of that is very encouraging. But also, I think even within the Native Lit space, a lot of the stories, a lot of the characters, are dealing with, I wish I knew something about my culture, because residential boarding schools. Or, I have been sexually assaulted, but I have resiliency, And I wanted to do something that would give a different view, a look at living, vibrant, Native culture, not culture that we wish we had and can only imagine, but more like what I see and live and do with my own kids. And so I think it provides a window into that in a way that Native Lit hasn't done as well. And although people have struggles and there is tension and all of that in the storytelling, it's not just another sexual assault somebody has to barrel through. Not that isn't something that we need to think about, but we've had a lot of that. And then also, I think in literature broadly, there's been a movement recently, which I think has been healthy and positive, to say, let's look at empowered, women's voices and start holding them up a little bit more. Let's look at a diversity of gender identities. And let's center some of those voices too. And all of that it's emerging work, and we need much more of it. But it's encouraging to see. I think there's also been this kind of analysis of toxic masculinity stuff. But one of the things we haven't had enough of is an example of here's what healthy, positive masculinity is. Here's what it looks like for a boy going through stuff to find his way to that. And so I think it does that too, and I'm really excited about what that can mean and deliver. So anyways, more to say about that, but Where Wolves Don't Die, it formally releases June 18th, but it's up for pre-orders on Amazon and things like that.
Sounds great. Well, how about just once again thanking Dr. Treuer for being here with us today. Thank you, everybody.